class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the surprises and disappointments for the San Jose Sharks from this past season. And while there were only a few surprises to choose from, only a couple of players pleasantly outperformed expectations, there is a laundry list of players who were disappointments and, players, systems, coaches that were disappointments this past season. But for the sake of avoiding a multi-hour video, I've decided to cut that down to 3 surprises and then just 3 disappointments as well. And start off with the biggest surprise from this past season. It has to be Fabian Zidlicky, who was acquired last season in the Timo Meier trade. At the time, he was a relatively productive rookie player for the deep New Jersey Devils squad. 20 points in about 45 games that he played with New Jersey at that time, but it was viewed as a slightly disappointing return from the Timo Meier trade because there were rumors flying around that the Sharks could get the more hyped up Dawson Mercer from the New Jersey Devils instead. And so for that to end up as Fabian Zidlicky, definitely slightly disappointing at the time. But of course, he was given an opportunity, even played within the top 6 at times in the last 22 games of the season for the San Jose Sharks. But he at that time was just terrible, and that is even putting it lightly. Through those last 22 games, he was perhaps the Sharks' worst performing forward. Likely should have been a healthy scratch multiple times, but just barely managed to avoid that. He scored 0 goals over that time frame, even with some games played with some relatively decent productive forwards by his side, like Logan Couture or an Alexander Barabanov, and just 3 assists over that time frame. Zidlicky was not good at all, and so coming into the off season, he was up for contract, and it was obviously an inevitability that the Sharks would re-sign him. First of all, there's no reason to move on from a young player like that when you're a team in the position that the San Jose Sharks are. It's just a misuse of assets otherwise. But on top of that, Mike Grier obviously doesn't want to embarrass himself by moving on from the player that he's seemingly specifically targeted in the Timo Meier trade. So he was brought back for this season, and it ended up being the correct choice by far, as Zidlicky completely turned his game around. He started off playing in that bottom 6, but quickly worked his way up to the top 6 before finishing this year as a consistent top-line forward for the San Jose Sharks. And he was also the leading goal scorer for the Sharks with 24. It's not as though this was an incredibly lights-out season, but with the expectations that he came in with, it was a massive outperformance. Now, even though he did finish the year as a top-line forward, in the grand scheme of things on a normal NHL team, he would certainly be more of a middle 6 type of guy, and there were times this season where playing in that top-line role, he was somewhat exposed against other teams' really good top lines, but that's not necessarily a fault of his own. That is more so a fault of the situation that the San Jose Sharks found themselves in, and the fact that Zidlicky managed to be that goal-scoring player. He managed to fit in okay enough in that top line role. His defensive game was mediocre, but not all that terrible either. I'd say he massively outperformed expectations and was the biggest surprise for the Sharks this year. Then we get to Mikael Granlund. Granlund is obviously significantly older than Zidlicky, over the age of 30 here, a veteran in the NHL for sure, and his type of play is quite well known at this point. He is a pure playmaker in every sense of the word. He puts up tons and tons of assists and not very many goals. But last year, after having an okay start with the Nashville Predators, he ended up getting traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins and then not really performing particularly well with them. And so many thought that Granlund had perhaps fallen off a bit, and he was then traded in the Erik Karlsson deal as a bit of a salary cap dump. And coming into this season, especially since he was going to find himself behind the likes of Tomas Hertl and Logan Couture as a centerman for the San Jose Sharks, I don't think many people were expecting Mikael Granlund to put up that many points, perhaps like a 40 to 45 point season, but to be like a 16 time on ice per minute type of guy who's literally just there to be a warm body and put up like some okay offense on the power play perhaps, and that would be that. But that does not end up being the case due to the injury that kept Couture out for the majority of the season, and then Hertl getting injured for a good time period, as well as then getting traded to the Vegas Golden Knights. Granlund ended up becoming the Sharks' top centerman, and also the Sharks' just top forward in general, relied on very heavily by David Quinn in every possible situation, offensively, defensively, 5-on-5, 4-on-5, 5-on-4, 3-on-3, 4-on-4, every possible situation. David Quinn's first action would be to send Mikael Granlund over the boards, and that reflected in the time on ice situation. The player with the most time on ice was, of course, Mario Ferraro as the Sharks' number 1 defensemen. But then it was Granlund leading every other player, leading by far every other forward, but also many of the other defensemen that the San Jose Sharks did have. And he rewarded the San Jose Sharks with this ice time by putting up 60 points on the year. The fact that a player on a team that could barely manage to maintain a 2-goal per game pace managed to even put up 60 points is a miracle in and of itself. And yet Granlund managed to do it with not necessarily all that much help. He was frequently the Sharks' most effective offensive forward time and time again, and that was massively outperforming the expectations in which he came in, where he was expected to just be a relatively mid-level veteran. And then finally, we get to Thomas Bordo. This may be viewed as a bit of an off-the-board type of surprise pick, but I felt as though a lot of people were beginning to give up a bit onto Thomas Bordo, as he seemed to be falling into the trap that a lot of these young, skilled players can sometimes fall into, where they find themselves not quite good enough to be effective top 6 players in the NHL, but also not quite responsible defensively enough to find themselves becoming effective bottom 6 players in the NHL. And when you can't fit into the top 6 or the bottom 6, there's actually no other spot for you as an NHL forward, so you end up just becoming a minor league type of guy. It's kind of the similar situation that Danil Gushin currently finds himself in. Hopefully he can break out of it, but Bordo was given an opportunity here this season. He got the first few games of the year, didn't actually find much of a home, then went back down to the Barracuda for multiple months, where he stuck with in that AHL team, putting up a decent amount of points before given another opportunity near the beginning of March. After that trade deadline, there were a few holes to fill, and Bordo was called up, but this was a pretty routine call-up from the San Jose Sharks. It would not have been the first time that a forward from the AHL was called up, given a couple of games, and then sent right back down. But Bordo, in those first couple of games, put up 3 goals and made it a priority for himself to be able to maintain that lineup spot. And of course, after you score 3 goals in 2 games, you can't send a player back down. You can't bench him, so you give him another game. And then Bordo, he continues to perform well. You give him another one, and then another one, and another one, and then it just keeps snowballing forward as Bordo continues to play at a pretty high level. And then it comes to the point where maybe after 10 or so games, you don't necessarily have your best outing, but you've given yourself enough leeway where the coach still feels confident inserting you into the lineup the very next game. The fact that David Quinn, a player or a coach who is known to be pretty critical when it comes to these young forwards, ended up keeping Bordo in the lineup for the entirety of the rest of the season is a testament to how well Bordo did perform. Now, it didn't necessarily result in tons and tons of points. He still had an okay amount of points, I think 11 in the 27 games that he played, but there were a lot of times over that stretch of time where in which he came extremely close to setting up some goals, extremely close to scoring some goals, likely could have had a few more points with just a bit more luck involved. But even when you just look past the scoring, the fact is that Bordo felt like at least half the time was a top 3 forward for the San Jose Sharks, many of those times during the games that he played. So I was extremely impressed with Bordo, and going into this next season now, when Mike Grier is designing the roster that he is expected to have going into the year, he'll say, okay, I'll factor in Mikael Granlund here, Zetterlund here, Eklund here. Bordo has worked his way into that conversation. Perhaps he might be penciled in for a top 9 spot at the very least going into next season, because if he didn't have this stretch of games, he was slowly but surely getting surpassed on the depth charts. It was only a couple of years ago where you took a look at the Sharks' top prospects and you saw Eklund, and then right away you saw Bordo after that. But with multiple drafts and trades under the Sharks' belt now, players like Will Smith, Quinton Musty, Shakir Mukhamadullin, Philip Biestet have now shown up. Many people rank them above Bordo on the depth charts, and so if he didn't manage to have this strong stretch, who knows if he'd ever really get that opportunity again. So great improvement from him, and a big surprise on the year from my perspective. Then we get to the disappointments on the year, and the biggest one in my eyes has to be Alexander Barabanov, kind of the opposite trajectory to Fabian Zidlicky. The past couple of years, he's been with the San Jose Sharks. He has never actually experienced any sort of playoff hockey, so this is the type of environment that he has gotten used to, I guess you could say, in the NHL, which is a losing type of situation, so you wouldn't expect that necessarily affect him too much. And yet, after a couple of years straight of putting up 50 points and being an effective, at least second-line player for the San Jose Sharks. Suddenly, it was just a complete disappearing act this season. There were some questions about his health throughout the year. I think there was like a COVID situation, then like a broken finger type of thing, but just watching him on the ice, he just did not seem engaged at all with what the San Jose Sharks were doing. And so, like I said, opposite of Zetterlund, while he started the season as a top-line player, a top-6 type of guy, he slowly but surely fell down to the bottom 6, playing even some fourth-line minutes at time, and then eventually was more so just a healthy scratch in a few games at the end of the season before being shut down due to injury. And just, like I said, you watched Barabanov play, and his head did not really seem in it, which is quite interesting, because this was the type of season that you would expect him to have even more motivation than in the past, especially compared to last year, because this was the final year on his contract. He's on an extremely affordable $2.5 million. He would have been the absolute perfect rental for pretty much every playoff team in the league had he actually managed to maintain that like 40 or 50 point pace that he had previously been on in the past couple of years. And we even saw the New York Rangers rumored to have been interested in Barabanov even through all the troubles he had this season, with the only thing standing in their way was the fact that the Sharks could not retain any salary on his deal. But I can imagine that would not have been as much of a deal breaker had Barabanov actually been doing well. And so it was a missed opportunity for San Jose, who now don't really get any value, and imagine Barabanov now walks in free agency, but a massive missed opportunity for Barabanov, who this was an opportunity for him to get some playoff hockey under his belt, but because he just did not seem particularly interested in actually playing this season, it didn't end up happening. And so indeed, the biggest disappointment for the San Jose Sharks for sure. Then we get to Anthony Duclair. Now, this is a bit of an interesting one because of the fact that Duclair technically didn't have that terrible of a stint with the San Jose Sharks. He put up 27 points in 56 games. If you put that over a full season of 82 games, that would be around 40-ish points, which wouldn't be like a leading scorer for the San Jose Sharks. That would still find himself behind Granlund, Zetterlund, and Eklund as fourth on the team in scoring, but not necessarily the worst of cases. But the fact is that expectations were pretty high for Duclair as a former 30-goal scorer, someone who was just in the Stanley Cup Finals with the Florida Panthers, had almost put up 60 points a couple of years ago. It was felt as though that he would manage to be, perhaps, especially with expectations being relatively low for a player like Mikael Granlund, he was expected to perhaps be the Sharks' best player, at least second best player, of course, after Tomas Hertl, be that winger that complements him exceptionally well, and managed to maybe even put up like a 50-point, 25 goals type of season. Not quite at the level as he was at in Florida, because Florida, were a very good team at the time, but relatively close to that. But the Sharks didn't really manage to get that out of Duclair, and made even worse by the fact that, yes, the points were there, but the type of play style that Duclair had just did not suit the role that he was thrusted into. Perhaps that is just sort of a clash of what the San Jose Sharks should have been expecting from Anthony Duclair, because when he was with the Florida Panthers, he played more of like that middle six type of second power play role, only given about 15 minutes a night, and so the type of game that he plays worked out very, very well. But for the San Jose Sharks, he was playing on the first line more often than not, finding himself, with like a Zetterlund or like finding himself with a Granlund, or a Tomas Hertl on that top line. And Duclair just doesn't really fit in that regard. He's very much a neutral zone type of player, doesn't necessarily take his defensive positioning particularly seriously, or at least he didn't take it so seriously with the San Jose Sharks. And so a lot of times he's kind of cherry picking through the neutral zone, looking to get a breakaway, which he did get frequently. It felt as though every other game featured an Anthony Duclair breakaway, or at the very least a 2-on-1. But in the grand scheme of things, even if it became like, oh look, but Duclair managed to get a goal here tonight, how bad could he have been? It felt as though for like 80% of the shifts that he was just not really making much of an impact on the ice. And so the point totals were somewhat there, but taking a bit of a deeper look, it didn't feel as though Duclair was all that great. In the end, it didn't end up being all that bad. The Sharks still managed to trade him to the Tampa Bay Lightning, and while the Sharks maybe were hoping for slightly more value than they got, a third-round pick plus a decent prospect in Jack Thompson, certainly not the end of the world. So it all worked out, so to speak, in the end, but definitely it felt as though Duclair came in a bit under the expectations that were expected from him. And then we get to the last disappointment here. That would be Jan Ruda. Now, of course, you could really circle pretty much any defenseman that the San Jose Sharks had this season and call them a disappointment, and you certainly wouldn't be wrong, but it felt as though, to me, Ruda really stood out above the rest. Ruda was involved in that Erik Karlsson trade similar to Mikael Granlund, and he was not necessarily expected to be like a consistent, amazing top 4 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. While he has won Stanley Cups in the past, he wasn't necessarily a big part of those victories, but what I thought he would manage to bring to the San Jose Sharks is a sense of calmness and stability on the back end. Yes, he would be thrusted into a top 4 role, and yes, he might get exposed a couple of times by some really good teams when put into roles that he really shouldn't be, but what we ended up getting out from Ruda is that some games he would be really lights out, and then some games he would be absolutely terrible. The variance in Jan Ruda's game was similar to the variance of his defensive partner Henry Thrun, but Thrun has the excuse of playing his first full season in the NHL. Jan Ruda is supposed to be more experienced, more knowledgeable, more secure, more consistent than that, and yet for whatever reason it felt as though you were flipping a coin and not really sure what type of game you'd end up getting from Jan Ruda. The risks that he would take at times throughout this season were extremely uncharacteristic of the type of player that Jan Ruda is, and so for whatever reason it felt as though that he could sometimes be like the second or perhaps even best defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, or he could be the worst by far on the night, which is just not what the San Jose Sharks needed, when that type of stability would have absolutely helped lead the way for a lot of younger defensemen on the San Jose Sharks, like Thrun, like Ty Emberson when he was playing, and even like for Mario Ferraro. It at times is forgotten because Ferraro has been the number 1 guy for the San Jose Sharks over these past few seasons, but Ferraro is still pretty young, in his mid-20s, has 0 playoff time in his career, so you might think that Jan Ruda could be that kind of leading veteran type of guy to teach the Sharks defense how to play the right way, and yet even he himself couldn't manage to play the right way, so what good could he have done for the rest of the players? And perhaps that was a big reason for why the Sharks defense was as lost as it really was this past season. But that will do it for this video. Like I said, there were a ton of possible disappointments to pick from. There were definitely some names that could have been on this list that were left off, but I kept it relatively short and probably not all that surprising. And then when it came to the surprises, that was a bit of slim pickings, but I thought there were still a few bright spots for the Sharks. Class dismissed.